Oh, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. You bring Beloiters together and they just can't stop talking to each other. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to Beloit College. I'm Scott Bierman, and I have the honor of being president at this school. As many in this audience know, I love the history of Beloit. I love it in part because this college and this city share both a name and a past that is more deeply connected than nearly any other town-gown relationship I know. And there are few connections that are worth a big honking exclamation point. One of these is Roy Chapman Andrews. Native to the city of Beloit and a graduate of the College of Beloit, he is a distinguished product of both, and we share in our appreciation of his extraordinary contributions to an understanding of our world, contributions that continue to be important scientifically, widely recognized, and wonderfully inspirational. At this school, we take enormous pride in offering an education that is fundamentally tethered to the liberal arts principles of learning broadly while thinking deeply, but likewise an education that we expect our students and graduates to put into practice daily in their professional and personal lives. We do so because we believe that the liberal arts foundation is a particularly valuable way of organizing yourself and preparing yourself for a world that 20 years from now will largely be unrecognizable from what it is today. The liberal arts in practice is a philosophy we embrace, and it is a philosophy that is personified throughout Roy Chapman Andrews' remarkable life. In his autobiography titled Under a Lucky Star, he somewhat breathlessly and with unbridled bravado writes about his adventures and accomplishments at the very start of this loving testimony to his own life. He notes, "Often I have had to sit on a lecture platform when I was going to speak and listen to a long introduction. It bored me stiff, and likewise the audience." After having read Andrews' autobiography, I suspect he was certain he could tell his story in a far more compelling way than anyone else, and was appalled when someone presented his life in anything other than one death-defying moment followed by another. He was probably right. Lesson learned. I, therefore, will depart from this lectern within a minute. After all, it is Alan Rabinowitz that we collectively came to see and to learn from. It is wonderful to have you here with us at Beloit's College and Roy Chapman Andrews College, nestled proudly in Roy Chapman Andrews town today. Thank you for being here. It is my honor to give up the podium to the president of the Roy Chapman Andrews Society, Joe Stottleman, who will offer you some further introductions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good afternoon. Thank you. On behalf of the Roy Chapman Andrews Society Board of Directors, I am very pleased to welcome you here tonight. Since 1999, the Roy Chapman Andrews Society has been driven by a simple mission: to honor the legacy of Roy Chapman Andrews, to educate the public about his work and his adventures, to promote the value of scientific exploration and discovery, and to emphasize Roy Chapman Andrews' ties to the city of Beloit. I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge some of our partners for tonight. First of all and foremost, Dr. Alan Rabinowitz. Tonight you join a very elite group of modern-day explorers who, like Andrews, shared the love for scientific exploration, scientific research, and discovery, and have willingly shared that with all of us. You have definitely changed our lives and the lives of many generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Roy Chapman Andrews Society is a membership-driven organization, and if you're not a member, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite you to become a member at www.roychapmanandrewssociety.org. There's a lot of great information there, not only about Roy and his work, but also about all the past recipients of the Distinguished Explorer Award. Please look us up and please consider becoming a member. We have quite a few sponsors that help us create tonight's event and all of our events throughout the year. And first and foremost is Beloit College. They have done everything that we've asked and more. They help us market this event. They provide technical support. They provide live streaming support so this can be shared nationwide through all of our members who are around the country. Beloit School District and the Beloit Memorial High School hosted this morning's event. 1,100 students joined in a presentation by Dr. Rabinowitz, and the energy in today's auditorium was just absolutely ecstatic. It was just a wonderful environment to be in. Our corporate sponsors include ABC Supply, Beloit College, Blackhawk Bank, Comerica Bank, Amy Lokrantz, Maggie Yankee Accounting, Resonate Web Marketing, the School District of Beloit, State Line Community Foundation, and Visit Beloit. And finally, I'd like to introduce our board of directors. If you would please stand, and we'll give them all a round of applause when we're done. First of all, immediate past president, Carla Swain. Vice President, Tom Warren. Treasurer, Andrew Yankee. Ann Bossum, Kevin Brown, Nick DeMassis, Vicki Denker, Lyman Elliott, Dina Fawn Johnson, Ken Forbeck, Tom Holmes, Jerry Spheme, and Steve Vavris. And our administrative assistant and the one who holds us all together, Ruth Carlson. Without this hardworking group, tonight's event, our summer camp, our family discovery night in the fall would not happen. So thank you all for your hard work throughout the year. And now I'd like to turn the podium over to a society board member, author, and Roy Chapman Andrews historian, Ann Bossum. Ann?
Thank you, Joe. Well, the confluence of history, which is what I get to talk about every year, is so strong between our award's namesake and this year's award recipient that I'm going to jump right in, so you can marvel with me at the connections. One could start the inventory with the coincidence that our awardee has been called the Indiana Jones of wildlife conservation, referencing that Hollywood hero whose adventuresome lifestyle is rumored to have been inspired by our very own Roy Chapman Andrews. And furthermore, for the first time, we are bringing here, first time since the creation of our award, we are bringing someone who shares the same field as Roy Chapman Andrews, which is zoology. Andrews was a zoologist, despite the Indiana Jones thing. They got that wrong, but that's what happens in the movies. Both men can trace their interests in the natural world to their childhoods. Andrews, who was born here in 1884, has described the setting of his youth this way. Beloit lay on the banks of the Rock River in a part of southern Wisconsin that was all fields and woods and rushing streams. Whatever the weather, in rain or sun, calm or storm, day or night, I was outside unless my parents almost literally locked me in. Little surprise then that Andrews' passion led him to become an explorer. After graduating from Beloit College in 1906, he headed to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City and talked his way into a job that ultimately led him to 24 years of field work, capped by service as the museum's director. But the greatest connection between Andrews and today's award winner arises from history that began 100 years ago when the recently married explorer embarked with his wife, Yvette Borup Andrews, on an 18-month-long expedition to Asia and back. The Andrews' travels took place during an era when there were vast museum halls to fill, and one's skill with a gun was a measure of one's success as a naturalist, an idea that offends our modern sensibilities, but was very much in esteem then. Nonetheless, both Roy and Yvette were adept with firearms, Andrews having perfected his marksmanship during his youth here. But the shared the pair shared a passion for a different kind of shooting too, the shooting of pictures. And Yvette, who was very skilled in both color and black and white work, came along as the expedition's official photographer. This profession was still ruled at that time by bulky viewfinder cameras and glass plate negatives. So among other gear, she traveled to Asia with crates of negatives, 4 still frame cameras, 2 silent movie cameras, and a collapsible rubber darkroom that she and Roy had custom ordered from Abercrombie and Fitch. Flowering cherry trees greeted the couple in Japan at the end of their ocean passage, and if we want to imagine them exactly 100 years ago, we should picture them there, immersed in clouds of fragrant flowers. Their next stop was a detour in eastern China in pursuit of a predatory cat that Andrews had heard about from a Tennessee-born Methodist missionary named Harry Caldwell, someone Andrews characterized as a shooting missionary. According to Andrews, Caldwell traveled, quote, with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, ridding Chinese villages of man-eating tigers, the while he poured the residents' ears full of the eternal truth. Andrews and Caldwell spent 5 weeks tracking this so-called blue tiger, a name it had earned due to a genetic mutation that affected its coloration. After their second near miss, the duo, in desperation, pursued the cat into the tunnels of its underground lair, then thought better of the idea and retreated. In the end, they not only lost the chase, but about 15 to 20 pounds apiece of body weight. Well, by August of 1916, the Andrews expedition was back on course, and for the better part of a year, it progressed through wilderness areas of China not previously visited by Westerners, reached the edge of Tibet, and crossed into what was then the British colony of Burma, now Myanmar. Through thick and thin, the pair collaborated, often exploring together, but sometimes splitting up to focus on individual pursuits. Roy recounts the story of returning to camp one evening to be greeted by Yvette with, quote, her hands filled with wet photographic negatives. He shares the dialogue that followed, a playful repartee that tallied their respective hauls for the day, with Yvette happily describing her creation of, quote, 14 color plates, and all good. Although the carnage of the hunt may seem a bit hard to swallow, one can nonetheless appreciate the couple's joy of discovery during their travels and work. I'll close by sharing Andrews' recollection of an evening he spent with Yvette beside a waterhole in the midst of a dense jungle. He writes, we started just at dusk and installed ourselves in the bushes a few yards from the waterhole. In half an hour, the forest was enveloped in the velvety blackness of the tropic night. We sat absolutely motionless and listened to the breath of the jungle, which, although without definite sound, was vibrant with life. Now and then a muntjac barked hoarsely, and the roar of a somber stag thrilled us like an electric shock. Tiny forest creatures rustled all about us in the leaves. For 5 hours we sat there absolutely motionless before heading home. We were silent with a great happiness as we groped our way back to camp, for we had been close to the heart of the jungle and were thrilled by the mystery of the night. And now, a century later, we are here to celebrate the explorations of yesteryear through the expeditions of another intrepid explorer. Having now set the stage from the past, it is my pleasure to bring forward Ken Yasukawa, Meade Family Professor of Science in the Department of Biology at Beloit College and Biology Department Chair, who will introduce you to this year's recipient of the Roy Chapman Andrews Society Distinguished Explorer Award.
Well, apparently, according to President Bierman, my job is to give the boring introduction. Before I do that, will you join me in turning off your phones, please?
Oh, I gotta turn off
Thank you. So our distinguished explorer got his bachelor's degree in biology and chemistry from McDaniel College and his master's and PhD from the University of Tennessee. Starting in 1982, Dr. Rabinowitz began a steady rise through the ranks at the Wildlife Conservation Society. He began as a research fellow, then became senior staff zoologist, then director of science for Asia, then director of the Global Carnivore Program, and finally executive director of science and exploration, a position he held until 2008. Now, this distinguished career would probably be enough for most zoologists, But our distinguished explorer was not done, not by a long shot. He is now president and CEO of a nonprofit organization called Panthera, an organization devoted to saving the world's wild cat populations. By the way, the zoologist in me compels me to tell you that Panthera is the name of a genus of about 16 species of big cats, and includes things like lions, tigers, leopards, and jaguars. He began his research with bats and raccoons, little-known facts, and he's published well over 50 papers and book chapters on bats, raccoons, jaguars, leopards, civets, tigers, rhinos, bears, and species you've probably never even heard of. On a personal note, one of his co-authors is George Saller. This is somebody who was very important to me in my development. George Saller he's commonly known as the father of wildlife conservation. And he wrote a number of books based on his fieldwork in Africa, books that I read as a young graduate student, and he helped to inspire me to become a field biologist. Back to our distinguished explorer, he has many popular press articles, 8 books, including one published in Thai, many, many accomplishments in conservation. I'll list a few in a minute. And of course, numerous awards, although probably none as prestigious as the Roy Chapman Andrews Society Distinguished Explorer Award. And as you know, Time magazine named him the Indiana Jones of wildlife conservation. We all know who Indiana Jones really was. So among his major accomplishments in conservation, in Belize, he established the world's first jaguar sanctuary. In Taiwan, the largest protected area and the last piece of intact lowland forest. In Thailand, he did the first field research on Indonesian tigers, Asiatic leopards, and leopard cats in what was to become the region's first World Heritage Site. In Myanmar, 5 new protected areas, including the country's first marine national park, first and largest Himalayan national park, and the world's largest tiger reserve. And finally, and to me, perhaps most impressive, at least to me as an ecologist, in working from Mexico to Argentina, he established the Jaguar Corridor, a series of biological and genetic corridors for jaguars across their entire range, their historic range, from Mexico to Argentina. And you have no idea how complicated and difficult that would be. Many of you remember our former president, Roger Hull. He was president here from 1981 to 1990. He used to end our commencement exercises by telling our brand new graduates to do well and do good. I think you'll agree that Alan Rabinowitz has done an amazing amount of good in conservation and has done exceptionally well as a conservation biologist. I would say he's the zoologist that I want to be when I grow up. So I'm going to call to the stage Joe and Ann and our distinguished explorer.
I have a citation to read as we prepare to present this award. Alan Rabinowitz, zoologist, biopolitician, conservationist, author, and ally. Half a century ago, your whispered promise to the beguiling eyes and yearning paws of caged cats set your compass toward a lifetime of exploration. True north became your determination to utter words that could save creatures who likewise found themselves stranded within a language beyond understanding. Passion kindled, you advanced toward advocacy, syllable by syllable, proving that a constrained voice can become a mighty roar. Your hopes stilled no longer, you reached the jungle domains of your childhood confidence and set to work. Through tireless observation and ingenuity, you divined the apex of life in the wild. Then, with the patience, agility, and cunning of a mighty cat, you inspired skeptics, antagonists, and despots alike to realize that the muddy signatures made by the soft pads of invisible feet were signs to be celebrated, not feared. The pledge of friendship you forged in childhood is ever present, forever honored by generations of sleek felines that melt into the shadows and thread the tangled pathways you preserved for them in gratitude so that they will evermore find their ways home. In appreciation for these contributions, we are pleased to bestow on you the honor of Distinguished Explorer from the Roy Chapman Andrews Society this 15th day of April, 2016 in Beloit, Wisconsin.
Sorry, I have sweaty palms. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. This is beautiful. This is quite beautiful. Oh, thank you. Now it's my turn, huh? Well, I'm not sure I can say anymore. Are we done? It's hard following all of this. Well, I have to say I'm truly honored. I really am. I'm honored to be here today to accept the Roy Chapman Andrews Society 2016 Distinguished Explorer Award. I couldn't ask to be following in better footsteps than the man whom this award is named after, and the incredible 13 scientists and explorers, most of whom I know, who have preceded me in getting this award. The time for great discoveries is past, said Louis Agassiz, famed biologist and geologist, in 1867. No student of nature goes out now expecting to find a new world. Within the first 10 years of that pronouncement, Nikolai Przewalski explored the Gobi Desert from end to end. Henry Morton Stanley traced the length of the Congo River. In the first half of the 20th century, Amundsen reached the South Pole, Beebe dove in a bathysphere to more than 900 meters, and Roy Chapman Andrews drove his fleet of Dodge cars into the Mongolian desert and discovered the fossil of a giant hornless rhino, followed not long afterwards by the first ever nest of dinosaur eggs. And the discoveries kept on coming. What's perhaps most amazing, and I don't think many people know this, is that the 21st century has actually been heralded by some as the golden age of discovery, with thousands of new plants and animal species being discovered. New bats, new rodent, new monkey, new sloth. There is absolutely no question that our world still contains untrodden landscapes, unexplained mysteries, and undocumented life forms. But also we realize now that exploration can occur in different ways. Many new discoveries are being made in the laboratory and on museum shelves because of new tools and new technology in fields such as molecular genetics. Proust, the French novelist, who I'm really fond of quoting, states, "Sometimes the real voyage of discovery is not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." That couldn't be more true. Whether in the field or in the laboratory, our mistake will always be, is in relegating exploration and biological discovery to the history books. Field biology is perhaps one of the most basic forms of exploration. And while it does not result often in front-page news, it is through such efforts, often underfunded and arduous, that we obtain the necessary data for understanding the Earth's wildlife and wild lands, and for protecting the delicate ecological fabric that sustains the world we live in. But interestingly, and as all of you can imagine, field biologists, naturalists, and explorers often find their life's paths in different ways. "I was born to be an explorer," Roy Chapman Andrews stated. "I couldn't be anything else and be happy." Well, my story is a little bit different. Our lives overlapped in so many ways, but in many ways our backgrounds, where we came from, couldn't have been more different. That's me, believe it or not. Born with a debilitating stutter. From the age of 2 to 3, I couldn't speak. I had what was called frozen mouth. When I tried speaking, my mouth would freeze up, it would block, it would result in just horrible sputterings, spasms, sounds, but no words coming out. Back then, people didn't understand stuttering. We now know that there's actual physiological, neurological changes which occur through it. But back then it was thought to be purely psychological. I was classified from kindergarten till the 6th grade as disabled. I was put in special classes for disabled children. Teachers told me I was broken. They put me in classes with students. Back then, they didn't understand things like ADD, dyslexia. We were all put in special classes. We were all put into disabled classes. Classes the other kids would make fun of and called the retarded classes, the stupid classes. When you're a child and adults tell you that you're broken, you think you're broken. So I just stopped talking. I stopped trying. If they thought I couldn't really speak, then I wouldn't even try to speak. But as a young stutterer, I learned what many stutterers learn. You can do certain things and speak. One of them is singing, and I could never sing. But another is talking to animals. And I would have my New York City-style animals. I would have my green turtles and my chameleons and my garter snakes and my hamsters. And I would come home from school where I didn't speak at all. They thought I was mute. And I would go into the closet and I would speak. And I would talk to the animals about my dreams and my hopes and who I really was. My parents didn't know what to do. They took me to hypnotists. I had drug therapy. I even had shock therapy to my brain. But of course, none of that worked because now we understand stuttering a lot more. But my father knew one thing worked. He knew that when I had a particularly bad day or bad week, which was often, because back then there wasn't as much zero tolerance for fighting as there is now. And I often ended up in the principal's office because I wouldn't take being teased. But he knew that what would relax me would be going to the Bronx Zoo in New York City. And at the Bronx Zoo at that time, which is no longer there, they had the Great Cat House with cat after cat in these bare concrete cages, roaring, smells, the power. It just mesmerized me. And my father would stand back, and I would approach the cages. And one by one, I would talk to the animals. My favorite was the jaguar, because this was the animal that didn't attack the cage, it didn't roar, it didn't pace, it just usually sat back and just watched me. And often if I talked to it long enough and calm enough, it came up to the bars. But I realized as a young child, and he started taking me there when I was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I realized that these animals, these big cats, huge, powerful, stronger than human beings, they're locked away in these cages for one reason. Well, more than one reason, but they stay locked in the cages for one reason. And that reason was that they didn't have a human voice. At least not a human voice or a voice like humans wanted to hear, just like me. They were locked in the cage the way I was locked inside my own head. Imagine if animals, even your own pets, could speak and say, please, I don't want to be here anymore. Or please, stop feeding me this junk. Or please, you haven't given me water in 2 days. Think of how we would treat the animals. Animals probably wouldn't even be in zoos. Zoos probably wouldn't even exist simply because, animals have voices, and they have consciousness, and they have emotions, but they don't have a human voice. And something that humans continually do is treat people who don't have a human voice like they expect, or don't look like them, or act like the norm. We treat them lower. We treat them differently. And yet, many of these animals and people are what make up the ecological framework of our world, of our life, add to the diversity in ways we're only now beginning to understand. And I realized that as a young child. And I told the animals, although I really didn't know what I was saying, I said to them, if I ever find my voice, and I didn't know if I'd ever not be able to stutter, I said, if I ever found my voice, I will try to be your voice as well. Although I didn't really know what I was talking about, but it really helped me to feel that I had to do something for the animals that helped me so much. So when I went to school, I decided I'd study wildlife. I'd study about animals. My exploration wasn't a running to, the way with Roy Chapman Andrews and many other explorers, running to exploration, running to adventure. For many decades, many years, my exploration was running away from the human world, wanting to be alone, wanting to be in the wild where I felt most comfortable, and wanting to be with animals that accepted me, stuttering or not, speaking or not, spoke in a different voice. And I felt truly bonded to my entire life, more than human beings. From my master's degree, so in college, I went and studied biology and chemistry. For my master's degree, I studied bats, raccoons. For my PhD, I studied bobcats in the Smoky Mountains and mostly black bears, capturing, that bear is not dead, it's just sleeping. Capturing black bears, putting radio collars on them, and following these animals around and figuring out what they do and how we can help them using scientific data, how we can help save them. This kind of work put me in wild places, put me away from people where I felt comfortable. I felt totally at ease. And it put me near the things I wanted to be near the most, animals. When I was getting my PhD, my mentor, we just spoke about George Schaller. George Schaller was both my mentor, and now he's the vice president for Panthera, working with me. He's in his 80s, and the man is still traveling and exploring in Tibet. George Schaller came to me as I was finishing my PhD and asked me if I wanted to go to a little-known country which just turned into Belize at the time. It had been known as British Honduras. This was 1980. It had been British Honduras, just gotten its independence. There was only one road through the entire country, a dirt road, and yet jaguars were being killed on that road somehow by the few cars that went down it. No one had ever captured or studied jaguars in the rainforest until then. Jaguars were considered some of the most mysterious, unknown cats. So I did it. I immediately accepted it. I didn't even know where Belize was. And I told my major professor, tell him I will do it. He said, don't you want to think about it? He said, no, what's there to think about? I will go and capture jaguars. I never saw a cow until I went to college in Maryland. But I knew I would capture jaguars because I knew by that time I would do anything, I could do anything I wanted to. People were not going to classify me as to what I could and couldn't do. And yet I kept on. I had stuttered until I was a senior in college. Till my parents found an experimental program upstate New York where they taught us how to manipulate. They only took the most serious stutterers, and they taught us how to manipulate our mouth, how to use our tongue, how to not have hard contacts. When you speak, you don't think about it. I can hear every single sound I make all the time. I can hear every stutter, every hesitation. I can feel where my mouth is. I have to think about my stuttering it's very easy now because I've done it for so many years. And it's actually very good because I can stutter when I want to. I can just drop all of it and stutter. In fact, I almost did that. When my first book came out, Jaguar, it was setting up the world's first jaguar preserve, and I was asked to appear. My publisher, William Morrow, got me on the Today Show, there was only network TV at the time, and it was a major accomplishment. It was like being on Oprah in terms of book sales. So I was asked to come on to the Today Show, and the correspondent at the time, a man who was very hot, hot in terms of very at the top of his game, was named Brian Gumbel. And he was told by the publisher, look, just to tell you, Alan has a stutter, but he can control it. Brian Gumbel wouldn't interview me. He refused. So the network said, look, he can come on, but it can't be Brian Gumbel. We have to find somebody who will do this. But he has to promise us that he will not stutter, because it's live TV. They made me sign a piece of paper saying that I wouldn't stutter. You can imagine how long ago this is. And the one person who agreed to interview me, who's a good friend of mine to this day because I so admire her, I was her first, she was brand new, and I was her first book interview of her career. I think, her first on-network interview of her career was Katie Couric. So Katie interviewed me, and it was great. And I don't know how I got off on that story. So the Jaguar, the Jaguar moves through the landscape. This Jaguar corridor we call the Underground Railway, because they can actually move. And I didn't know this at the time, but they can move through areas that we have no idea that they're moving through. But at the time, we didn't know anything about jaguars. I didn't even know how to capture jaguars. I tried capturing jaguars with old hunters, running them with dogs. It didn't turn out so well. One of our men got bitten by a poisonous snake. It was a very bad outcome. I ended up being able to make up traps and capture jaguars and put the first radio collar on Central American rainforest jaguars. I wouldn't let, at the time, conservation wasn't a field. It wasn't really a job. My mandate from Schaller, from the New York Zoological Society, was just to get science and publish papers. But I couldn't justify that. I couldn't just walk away with science. So when I had stayed in that area long enough, I asked George Schaller if I could stay an extra month, give me another month, just to see if I could convince the government to protect this area. So we ended up setting up the world's first and only jaguar sanctuary. To this day, there are many areas, protected areas throughout Central and South America with jaguars. But there still is only one area set up by a government specifically for the protection of the jaguars. Now, I felt this was a major accomplishment. I was thrilled. This is what I finally felt in my very troubled childhood and life, that this is what I was meant to be doing. This is where I felt comfortable, and I was giving back. I was fulfilling that promise made to the animals. I could have stayed there my entire career. I could have worked on jaguars, worked in Belize, but the call of the wild was really strong. I still was running away. I still wasn't. Once people knew me too well in an area, I wanted to leave. So I wanted to let others then take over for jaguars, thinking naively at the time that now that we had set up the world's first jaguar preserve, published the first data, lots of young scientists would flood in and start studying jaguars and setting up new reserves. Meanwhile, I was going elsewhere. So for the next 10 plus years, I spent traveling the world, surveying and studying tigers, leopards, clouded leopards, snow leopards, lions, going through the jungles, going through any place where I had to go, doing the first ever survey of clouded leopards, doing the first ever survey of the Indo-Chinese tiger through Thailand and Malaysia, taking me from the dense rainforest up into the Himalayas for the snow leopards. This was my life. This was what I felt I was meant to be doing. I'm sorry for this slide, but I have to show it, because this is what is happening out there. And it was happening then. Despite what I would do, no matter how many protected areas I set up, and over those 10 years, as was mentioned earlier, I set up tens of thousands of square kilometers in protected areas. I got lots of new laws passed, and I was losing. I felt like I was a failure because the cats were just dying. And it wasn't just that people were killing the cats. It was how people saw animals, how people treated animals. This is tiger bones. Tiger bones per gram are the most valuable substance today on the face of the earth. More than any illegal drug, more than any precious metal, more than any gem. Tiger bone powder is the most precious substance on earth. And that's why there's only about 3,000, 3,500 wild tigers left in the world today. This is a vat in Beijing, outside of Beijing at a tiger farm that makes tiger bone wine. It's a full skeleton of a tiger filled with wine. That's how tiger bone wine is made. This is a famous tiger temple in Thailand. The monks try to tell everybody, and I don't know why the tourists buy it, that they're helping tigers. The monks aren't helping tigers. The monks have declawed, defanged those tigers, and they're walking them around collecting money so that they can have a lot of money to do a lot of things monks shouldn't be doing. These are the genitals of male tigers, which are one of the most valuable parts of tigers. Young Asian men, this is not actually a part of traditional Chinese medicine, but it's a part of new Chinese medicine, made-up Chinese medicine. And some wealthy young Asian men buy this, put it in a bottle of whiskey, and drink it, and think it makes them much more powerful. This is what I had to try to deal with. This is what I couldn't figure out. What I realized is, no matter how much I thought I was doing, we weren't scaling it right. I wasn't making big enough areas. I wasn't going to be, we're still fighting these kinds of problems, and we always will. But I needed areas big enough in the world where tigers and other wildlife could survive despite some of the bad actions of human beings. Finally, in the 1990s, 1994, I was accepted after 4 years of trying. One of the big unknowns on the map for zoologists, for wildlife biologists, for all kinds of the sciences was Burma, called Myanmar, renamed Myanmar in 1989 by the Burmese military. Myanmar was an unknown land. By map, it had the most forests left in Indochina. So many people speculated this was the golden chalice for tigers, for the Sumatran rhino. We thought it possibly had the last herd of Sumatran rhino outside of Indonesia. Burma finally, but they weren't allowing anybody in. They were allowing some tourists. You can only go to certain places. You weren't able to go in the backcountry. The military dictatorship had it truly locked down. After 4 years of trying, almost 5, the Burmese military finally let me in. Interestingly, strangely enough, now Burma, it was a land locked in time. It still is, really, though now it's opened up and it's going to change quickly. This was like stepping back into time. In fact, the way I got in was the Burmese remembered a contemporary of Roy Chapman Andrews named William Beebe, who actually ran the Tropical Research Center. When Roy Chapman Andrews was working at the American Museum, Beebe was working at the Bronx Zoo, at the New York Zoological Society, running the Tropical Research Program. Beebe also had gone to Burma and actually captured a takin, a big animal that you'll see a picture of, for the Bronx Zoo. This country was so set back in time that when I tried to get in, and I told them I worked for the New York Zoological Society, they said, "Oh, we remember that. That's William Beebe. How is he?" Now, Beebe had died over 35 years earlier, but I didn't tell them that. I said, well, I actually said this because I learned how to do this with the Burmese military. I said, well, Beebe's feeling poorly. But he was he was feeling very poorly. And they actually gave me my first permit based on Beebe going into Burma. Now, what I wanted to do and what the government allowed me to do, at the time, although Burma had lots of forests left, according to maps, satellite imagery, they only had 1% as so-called protected areas, and nobody knew, including the Burmese government, what was still in those protected areas. Because as soon as you got out of the city into the countryside, really the government didn't rule much of the countryside. Indigenous communities, insurgent groups did. So nobody really knew what was in the wild, and I was really hoping to make some incredible discoveries, just like Roy Chapman Andrews came through and was encountering tigers everywhere. I was expecting to really start finding out that this was second to India in terms of tigers, and I was hoping to find the newest, last population of Sumatran rhinos. Sadly, little of that happened. Now, this is northern Burma, called the Kachin state. This is China. This is northeast India, Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. This is Tibet. After spending several years in Burma, now Roy Chapman Andrews, he traveled through, he came and explored an area I had also explored, but not from the Burmese side. These are called the Gali Gongshan Mountains. This whole region was considered, has been for many decades, considered one of the most remote, unexplored regions left in the world because it's the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. It's where some of the world's great rivers, like the Brahmaputra and the Irrawaddy and the Mekong, come and start. This is a true, in the books and movies about Shangri-La, mystical Shangri-La is supposed to be in this region. It's not, but people thought it was because it was so rugged and so unknown and so mountainous and so hidden away. Roy Chapman Andrews came through China and came into Burma right here, into an area called Bamo. This was at the time, 100 years ago, this was incredibly rugged, incredibly remote. My goal, after spending 2 years in Burma and realizing that the forests of Burma were what we call empty forests, local people were so poor and so downtrodden that much of the wildlife had been killed out. There was no sign of Sumatran rhinos anymore. What I was hoping is that what I would find up here would be a gold mine. But there had been very few explorers ever to come up there. You could fly a small twin-prop plane to this city called Putao. And from here to the Tibetan border, it was just snow-capped mountains. It was just all walking. The other thing that was so special about this area, and Roy Chapman Andrews knew that, is that this region is where the Indo-Malayan ecosystem, the typical kind of habitats you think of in places like Thailand and Burma, it's where they transition and meet the Himalayan ecosystem. In that transition area, of which almost none exist anymore in the world, there could be all kinds of new species. I knew that. And I wanted to see what there could be up there. But to the government, what I told them is because that was a very restricted area, because that wasn't ruled by the central government, that was ruled by the Kachin, an indigenous group who to this day, even with so-called peace, have not signed the peace agreement. So I had to get permission not only from the central government to even go up there, but then they asked me to get permission from the Kachin. And I said what I wanted to find is where the northern extension, if there was tiger, there were indications. A lot of people said, if you want to find tigers, there are no more tigers down here. All the tigers are up there. All the tigers are going to be in the far north. And that would have been the northernmost extension of the Indo-Chinese tiger's range. So I wanted to search for tigers, and I wanted to see, according to the map, if it was still intact. No one had ever documented snow leopards in northern Burma, but there looked to be no reason why snow leopards couldn't be coming into northern Burma. And if they were, I wanted to find that one hidden valley, which there's almost none, there's only one other one documented in the world, and that's in Bhutan, where tigers and snow leopards walk the same valley. I wanted to get that in northern Burma. But the way forward was kind of rough. No one in the government, no one down in the whole central southern part of Burma knew how to get up there. I mean, they knew I could fly up there, and then we could talk to tribal people or indigenous people or insurgents and try to get through there, but there were no maps, no real maps of how to get through these mountains. So we did what any explorer does. You don't need maps. You just go. You make the maps as you go along. So we went to the nearest town of Putao in a twin-prop plane, which only flew once a week from Mandalay. It took us 4 days just to get up to just to fly to the town. Then we started walking. Well, first we asked a lot of people in the village whether anybody knew the way forward. I expected there to be lots of people who had walked up that far north, but almost no one had, because it was seen as very dangerous. It was seen as a world ruled by dangerous indigenous people. And they were scared. They were scared of going that far up into the snowy mountains. But while we were storing up, so we said, if we can't find somebody to guide us, we'll just start going till we hit the first village and pick up people along the way. But we had to stock up on supplies because we had a lot of porters, and porters don't eat freeze-dried food from Cabela's. You need to get rice. You need thousands of pounds, hundreds of pounds of rice. And we had to stock up in the local village. And it was in this village that I made the first discovery of something that got me really excited. So while we were shopping for food in this village, all of a sudden, I see this strange-looking head in a market. It wasn't being sold. It was just back there placed. This is why in discovery, in biological exploration, the most important thing is not so much to expect new landscapes, but to have new eyes, keeping an open mind. Everything around you can be different than what it seems to be. As soon as I saw this, I knew what it was. Nobody else knew what it was. The local people selling it or having it didn't know what it was. This was a blue sheep. Blue sheep had never been documented from Burma, and it's the major prey of snow leopard. Usually, wherever blue sheep occurs, snow leopards occur. They swore. Now, it was tricky because I knew we were right on the border. We were near China and India. It could have come from China or even the Himalayas in India. Now, this man hadn't hunted it, but he swore it was brought down from a tribal person up where we wanted to go, to the last village in northern Burma. This was a good indication I would possibly find. If I couldn't find snow leopard, at least maybe I would document the first ever documentation of blue sheep in the country. Now, fortunately, there were lots of tribal people up there. Fortunately, as we moved, there were enough villages of indigenous people, of tribal people, to where they made their own pathways, if you want to call this a pathway. What they couldn't guarantee me, it was always funny in the beginning, because I'm not that big a person, but they were very small. And they said, you know, these are built for us. We don't know if it's going to hold you. I said, well, let's find out. And I usually had 3 or 4 of them with a lot of bags go in front of me. But these were very, very tricky rattan bridges, usually over whitewater rapids, where if you fell and went down, you wouldn't be recovering from it. But this turned out, as much as this seemed intimidating, this ended up being heaven compared to what we started facing as we went further north. Because eventually we ran out of, in areas where there were no indigenous villages, in areas where we ran out of trail or didn't want to cross 3 mountain ranges because it would take us a week, an extra week. We actually hired villages to make trails, to build trails into the side of mountains. And that's actually a walking trail. It took 3 days to build, but they have hammered it into the side of a rocky mountain, tested it, because I'm not going on it till it's tested, and we were walking along the side of a mountain. We did this very often. We built our own trails. And in areas where we had to cross rivers, we had to build, if you want to call this a bridge, we had to build our own bridges in order to walk across. Walking across for me was trial enough, but the local people would be walking across with huge burdens on their back. No one ever fell in, amazingly. People did fall in, they told me, but not on our trip. Eventually, after several weeks, we ended up at the beginning of what was called the Snowy Mountains, what the Burmese called the Snowy Mountains. The only man I had documented who had been up in this region before me was a British botanist named Frank Kingdon Ward, who collected plants, but he knew nothing about the animals. He wasn't interested in the animals, and he didn't talk about any animals when he wrote his book. Soon as we hit the Snowy Mountains, things got much, much more rugged, much, much more remote. This was exploration again. While I had been in Rangoon, in Yangon, I had searched all these old bookstores. There were some very old bookstores in Rangoon from the British time, because it was so set back. I had found an old book, which was published in 1962, called The Turon of Burma. And it was about a pygmy group in this part of the world, in this part of where we were going. It turns out in 1962, a Burmese medical expedition, hearing that there were true pygmies, and there were Mongoloid pygmies, the only known Mongoloid pygmoid group in the world in this region, they mounted an expedition down a side canyon. They had reached where we had reached, right here. But it was down that side canyon where they found these Turon people. And they said these Turon people were so inbred that they were probably expecting them to be extinct within a couple of decades. So I had no idea if these Turon even existed anymore. It said because they were pygmies, they were often captured as slaves, treated badly, hid from people. Something inside me, it was interesting, and I remember this. I wanted to do it from an exploratory point of view. I wanted to talk with the Turon if they were still alive. Nobody had documented them since 1960s, and it was published in the journal Science. I wanted to see if any was still there, but I also wanted to visit to see if these people went extinct or not, because something inside of me from my childhood made me feel close to these people, if they were still there. Now, the problem was I wasn't allowed by my Burmese permits, by the Burmese government, to take any diversion. The military was very strict, and they sent military watchers with me on the expedition. I told them I had to go up this side canyon. They refused. They said, we can't go. You don't have a permit to go any place other than compass straight north. This was an eastern diversion. So to compromise, because we were in the middle of nowhere, they weren't going to stop me. They weren't going to shoot me. So I said, okay, if you don't want to go, if you're fearing that you'll get in trouble, you stay here. I'll take 2 or 3 people with me. I had 2 or 3 people, and we went up the side canyon, and we eventually, through a long process, which one of my books, Beyond the Last Village, talks about, we met the last of the Turon. There were only 12 pure Turon left. In the 1960s, when they had documented them, there were several hundred. There were only 12 pure Turon left, with high rates of cretinism, retardation, goiter. They were a very sickly people because they only inbred. They had originally come from Tibet, but in order to preserve what they felt was the purity of their race, they wouldn't outbreed. So consequently, they were going extinct. And the only breeding male left was Dawi. Dawi was about 39 at the time. He desperately wanted a wife, but there was no Turon for him to marry. There was nothing for him to do. He was the last of his line. Dawi was the strongest of all my porters. He was incredible, this man. We couldn't speak the same language. First of all, I always had to have translators. But now I'm not translating from Burmese. by the time we hit the Tyrone and we were picking up villagers along the way who could speak the dialects of the next village, I had to go through 3 translators in order to try to speak to Dawi. So I stopped trying to speak to Dawi. He and I went alone up into the mountains. What I had learned from my childhood is that you don't have to speak. You don't always have to speak. And through a series of hand movements and we communicated. For 3 days, we talked to one another about him wanting to get married, about wanting to have a child. He motioned things. And I talked about things in words I knew he didn't understand, but he felt. It was a communication. It was the same communication I had with the animals when I was a child. And you could do that. Now, Dawi taught me a lot. Dawi, first of all, was one of the best hunters of the tribes. These people up there in the far north have no guns. So there's no way to get gunpowder or guns or anything like that. They could probably get guns from China, but there's no way to get ammunition. It didn't make sense. So they made crossbows. Triggers made out of bare bone. The crossbow would be made out of a local hardwood and then a fiber as the string. And they used local poisons. They had poison arrows, which they had different amounts of poisons on different arrows, like bullets, if they were going to shoot a bear or a deer or something else. He was incredible. They never wore shoes. They didn't have shoes. Any kind of Western clothing that they did have, like his hat, they got from trading with China. And what Dawi showed me and taught me was that if I wanted to find, this was not back 100 years ago in Roy Chapman Andrews' day. Unfortunately, I couldn't see wildlife everywhere. If I wanted to figure out what was up there, I had to look at what the hunters who were going out for sometimes a month at a time were killing. Or I had to look at what the women in the villages were serving me. Because I was a guest, I would get these delicious delicacies like this sirao head or this monkey head. And instead of eating it, well, I had to eat some of it actually, but I would save it all. And I would be able to start identifying what was up there based on what the hunters were killing, were bringing in. That's called a marbled cat. That's called a golden cat. That's called a red goral. These are very rare species. These species are mostly unknown even to any scientist. And what was so amazing is what I found out. They don't use any money up there. Why would they? Why need money? What they needed was salt. Desperately needed salt. They didn't know why. They knew if they didn't have salt, or their animals didn't have salt, the animals would die. And if they're yaks, or if they didn't have salt, they would get goiter, and they would get sick. So they traded with Chinese traders. That's a tribal trader from China. And they would trade some of the rarest Himalayan species in the world, some of which were thought to be extinct. They would be trading skins, piles of skins, for a pan of salt. Sadly, now this is good salt. Much of the trade wasn't good salt. It was purple salt. It was dirt salt, which didn't even have iodine in it. And that's what they really needed, iodized salt. Now they do. But this was what they were trading. This is how we discovered things. And through seeing what the people were eating and killing and trading, I discovered populations of Himalayan species that had been either wiped out or almost had gone extinct in other parts of the world, of the Himalayas. Species like the takin. This is what Bibi brought back to the Bronx Zoo in the early 1900s, but it died. Amazing, incredible species like the musk deer. It's not a true deer. It's in its own family. It roots around with these long fangs. Species like the goral, the red panda, and the red sirao. These species, we discovered intact, good populations of these animals, these Himalayan species, which are almost gone from the earth. And people hadn't known it. Well, people elsewhere hadn't known about this. But more than that, I discovered some completely new species for Burma, which hadn't been known in Burma. Eventually, we were able to fully document the true presence of blue sheep. Never got snow leopard. I don't think snow leopard come into Burma, although some people still think it does, and I didn't find it. But we did document blue sheep coming in on the Chinese-Burmese border. We documented a very rare species of deer called the black muntjac, never known in Burma. I documented an animal called the stone marten, never known in Burma. This was perhaps my most incredible find, believe it or not. This little animal is called the back-striped weasel. At the time we discovered it in Burma, there were only 12 specimens in museums in the world. And we had no idea where it existed in the world. And the way I discovered this is what sometimes true exploration and discovery is about. Again, seeing with new eyes. I didn't see this animal. What had happened is one day in a hut, as the women were preparing a meal and serving me hot tea, they grabbed the teapot with a pot holder, a piece of fur, and I saw the white stripe on the fur. And because I had spent thousands of hours in mammalogy classes studying skins of things, I knew what things didn't look right and I knew what jumped out. That's part of exploration. You're not going to just see something and say, my God, I've never seen that before. You've got to know what exists out there. You've got to have studied everything else in order to know what's different. And that pot holder was the 13th specimen in the world of the back-striped weasel. But my most incredible discovery was a new species not to Burma, but to science. A new species never known before in the world. And I discovered this from what the local hunters called their trophy board. When the hunters killed their animals, they would put the skull on I called it a trophy board, they didn't. They would put the skull up on their walls on this kind of rattan board, and nobody could touch the skulls, and nobody could take the skulls down. Otherwise, it lost its power, and they wouldn't be able to hunt that animal again. That's what they believed. So I had to figure out a way, because I was noticing on this board some of these skulls. Again, I had seen tons and tons of barking deer skulls. Something looked different, and I had to examine it. But I couldn't touch it, nor could I take the board down. So we worked out a trade agreement. We worked out that if we traded them enough rice, they would take the whole board down. I could barter for the entire trophy board. You couldn't take down a skull individually. But once they had too many trophies, normally they would burn it. They would take the board and burn it and start a new one. And that was okay. So I said, instead of burning it, how about if you think you're going to burn it, but you carry it for me to the next village, so it's gone, and I'll give you a certain amount of rice. That worked. They did that. And it turned out that that deer, that skull, led me to discover, eventually I had to take back parts, do genetic analysis at the American Museum of Natural History, DNA fingerprinting. That skull ended up being the second smallest and the most primitive deer known in the world, where all of its relatives have been prehistoric and gone extinct. That skull, this is a true deer. It's the longest fangs of any true deer, and those are its full antlers, only about 1/4 of an inch long. But I also heard this deer ate fruit. It was a frugivore, and it was social. There were no living deer which were frugivores and social. And I said, I've got to see this. Subsequently, in 2 expeditions I mounted after this expedition, in order just to get this deer, since they were killing so many of them, I said, I will pay you or trade you. Well, I couldn't pay them. It was in trade. I will trade you a huge amount of things for bringing me a live, uninjured deer. And eventually we were able to get 3 of these barking deer, 3 of these new deer to science. everything about this deer, its entire structure, its behavior. The local people called it in their Burmese language a leaf deer, because when they killed it, they could wrap its entire body inside one large leaf of one of the local plants. They eventually got 3 of these. I brought them, we actually carried them down expedition-like to Burma, back to Burma on a plane. That was a whole different story. And put them in the local zoo, and I tried taking care of them, but it didn't work. They ended up dying. There are none of these deer are currently alive in captivity in the world, but we've protected them since then. Finally, I got to the big Himalayan mountains. The big Himalayan mountains, which is Mount Kakaborzi, the largest, highest peak, almost 20,000 feet in Southeast Asia. So far only climbed by one man, Tagashi Osaki, a Japanese Himalayan climber who, before he climbed Kakaborzi, was the first on a team to climb the north face of Everest. Sadly, he was trying a new route on Everest, and he died in 2011 of pulmonary edema on Everest. He was the only man so far to climb Kakaborzi. 3 expeditions have tried since then. It's not that it's so high, it's that it's so unstable. And there are landslides. We had mountaineers with us, so Burmese alpine people, but we didn't have good enough equipment. So we just tried going as far as we could till we got caught and almost died in an avalanche, and it was too dangerous, so we turned back. But by the time we turned back and returned to Putao, we had walked 600 kilometers, and it had taken us about a month and a half. It's not on the same level of Roy Chapman Andrews, but it was an incredible expedition. As a result of that, I didn't care how far I went. What it is what we found. And I brought that to the Burmese government, and they created the country's largest park, 4,000 square kilometers, called Kakaborzi National Park, that today stands as one of the largest and only true Himalayan parks in all of Asia. That park is now protecting both the indigenous people, the Taron, who now have as much salt as they want, and those animals. But I never found tiger. I never found snow leopard. I never found tiger. But what the people told me, what the indigenous people said, you're in the wrong area. They said, you're in the Himalayan ecosystem now. You're not going to find tiger. They said, but you can find tiger. What you did is this is where we hiked to, the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. From here, they said, if you go in this valley here on the border with Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, this is where all the tiger are. And I said, have you ever been there? And they said, no. They called it the Valley of Death. They called it the Valley of Death because the malaria, it was falciparum, brain malaria, was so bad that so many people died in there each year that people were terrified of going in there. And it was also called the Valley of Death due to what happened in World War II, which I'll mention to you soon. So we mounted another expedition. Now, saying this is a lot easier than getting permits from the Burmese government. It took another 2 years to get permits to go into the Valley of Death, partially because they were afraid I would die. And they, like the TV station, made me sign a document saying I wouldn't die. Not I wouldn't stutter, but I wouldn't die. They actually had me sign a document saying if I died, it wasn't their fault. So we went into Hukong Valley. Now, Hukong Valley is an incredible place. If you're a World War II aficionado, a real aficionado, you'll know of Hukong Valley. Because Hukong Valley, when the Japanese took over the Burmese Road in World War II, in order to keep Chiang Kai-shek and China in the game, the Allies had to fly supplies over from India because the Japanese had taken the Burma Road. And they were flying over what was called the hump. The hump is where we had just hiked up into northern Burma. And too many planes were going down. They didn't have good technology, And there were too many crashes. Too many planes were just flying into mountains and being lost. So they decided, the British first decided to try to build a road from India through the rainforest, through the thick jungle, and come behind the Burma Road, behind the Japanese. But it was too tough. Too many people died. And they gave up. And then a general came along, an American general, who was nicknamed Vinegar Joe Stilwell. And that's why it's called Stilwell's Road. It's also called Lido Road, but it's known as Stilwell's Road. He said, we'll do it. The Americans will do it. Who'd they put on the front line? One of the only black regiments in World War II. They were put on the front line to be taking Japanese snipers, shooting at them, and to be building this road. It cost a lot of dead soldiers, but they built this road. This road had never, by the time I got up here, World War II people were speculating whether this road even existed or not, because nobody was allowed up there. And they figured it had been taken over by jungle, which roads normally would be, because the Burmese never fixed it. This road was built so well by the Americans that this is the intact road. I mean, it gets muddy in the rainy season, but this is the road as the Americans built it, never being upgraded, never being fixed. This allowed us to go deep into the Hukong Valley. Not all the way where they had originally built, but deep inside. Now, most of the bridges had been long destroyed or blown up by the insurgent groups. So we had to have villages rebuild bridges. Some of these bridges took a month, which actually isn't that long, but you should see the bridge. I always walked over them. I would never be in the truck when the trucks would go over them, but they always made it. Sometimes all the bridges had been wiped out, so we had to figure out, if the road still existed, how to get our vehicle with the supplies over the rivers. And the local people, of course, just put some boats together and took us over. But eventually the road petered out. We couldn't go any further. The road was in too bad a shape. And we got on elephants and just kept on going. Now, as soon as I ran into the indigenous groups, I could see that there were tigers here. They told me there were tigers there, but now I saw it. Because all the indigenous groups, they still kill tigers. Lisu and Naga, they had tiger skins, tiger teeth. They also had hornbill, wild boar. They had all kinds of animals. These are shaman, Naga and Lisu shaman. But also, just to complicate matters, if it wasn't difficult enough, also in Hukong Valley was a base of army insurgents. The Kachin Independent Army, who was fighting the government, had their main military base, which the Burmese had never been able to get to, inside of Hukong Valley. So the Burmese government gave me permission to go as deep as I wanted, as long as I would open up dialogue. This was interesting. They asked me to try to help them open up dialogue with the Kachin. Now, I could do that because I was never talking about politics. I was talking about wildlife. The Kachin considered Hukong Valley to be their own heritage. This is where they lived. They didn't want all the tigers dead. The central government said they wanted to protect tigers too, mostly in order to try to calm down the Kachin. So they used me, but I knew I was being used, and I used them as they used me for wildlife conservation. There was a lot of press about me for about 5 years. I was being blasted in the press because I worked in Burma. At the time, the only foreigners still in Burma were the Red Cross and me from the Wildlife Conservation Society, saving animals. And a lot of press, like at The Guardian in Britain, published articles. One was called Save the Rhinos, Kill the People. And it was that I was helping the Burmese government subdue the local people because I was working there. And I said, when you show me that tigers and other wildlife can vote for who they live under in a country, then I'll listen to your political arguments. Till the wildlife has a vote in things, I'm going to go any place on earth and try to save them and do whatever deals I have to do in order to save them, as long as I don't hurt people. In fact, eventually the Red Cross pulled out, and I actually had to carry, against government permits and permission, I carried HIV drugs up to the remote villages, because even the Red Cross pulled out, which I was so disappointed in. But I wanted to go deep, deep inside of Hukong Valley, to the most remote areas. Eventually, the only way in, couldn't even go by elephant. We had to have local people build us bamboo rafts and raft up the rivers and go deep into the interior where there were some Lisu hunters would go, but basically no people lived. There I set up camera traps in order to see if there were tigers, and there were lots of tigers. There were lots of tigers. It was the only place, well, actually there's one other place on the Thai-Burmese border. Only 2 places left in all of Burma which had tigers, and these cameras showed us about tigers. So I said, this is great. Now that I've helped the government promised me they would protect this area as a tiger reserve. So I asked them to protect the wild core, 1,500 square miles, as a tiger reserve. The way I chose where I wanted protected is because outside of that, where there were tigers, also in Hukong Valley, there was tons of bad things going on by the people. Gold mining, artisanal gold mining, because the price of gold was shooting up. So it was worth it for them, for even tiny bits of gold, to be completely devastating the environment, and using mercury of all things. People were coming in and hunting. Now that miners and others were coming in the area, there were lots of people killing the wildlife in order to sell, that's bear paws, to sell to Chinese traders. Bear paws are considered a huge delicacy among Koreans. This was big money. They were dynamite fishing. They were throwing dynamite in the water, homemade gunpowder and dynamite, in order to blow up fishes and take them out. And worst of all, because of how dangerous it was, they started growing opium. The Shan, an indigenous group called the Shan, came in and started growing opium. And this was dangerous because we didn't know it. One of our people almost got killed because they would set up shotgun traps around the opium plantations. So we had to walk through the jungle like you did in the Vietnam War, looking for wires across, or strings across the trail, because there were shotgun traps trying to protect the opium plantations. And we didn't know where they were. So I set about talking to people. I said, this is crazy. I can't deal with all this other stuff people are doing. So I just want to protect the tigers in the interior. So of course, I had to do what I've spent my whole life running away from, and that's going back to people, because human beings are at the core of protecting wildlife. So I had to speak to the local people. I had to speak to the local police. Had to speak to all the headmen of the different tribes. Had to bring the Burmese government together with the head of the insurgents. But the most interesting thing happened. Again, I was knocked out of my complacency. I thought, this is great. I'm going to get the world's largest tiger reserve set up, about 1,500 square miles, pristine. And the government officials, in a meeting with higher government officials, they said to me, are tigers only in that central area? And I said, no, tigers are all through Hukong Valley, and they're not in other parts of Burma. And they said, so why aren't you trying to protect all of Hukong Valley? And I said, all of Hukong Valley? All of Hukong Valley is about 9,000 square miles, and it's got tons of people in it. It's got a military camp in it. It's got gold mining. It's got everything bad in it. And they said, but that's where the tigers are also. Why are you not trying to do that? And it was like a smack to the head. Again, I should have known better by then, that if you're going to save wildlife, it's not just about locking them up in these pristine areas, that you have to save them also with the people, within the human landscape where they wander. So I said, why are you asking me to do that? Why don't you say, you can lock it up, you're the forestry department. And they said, because the government's ruled by dictators, military dictators. And I had their ear at the time. They said, you could get to the top, we cannot. So I did. So I got to Secretary, he was called Secretary 1. Kim Yun, General Kim Yun. He was the most feared man in all of Asia, supposedly, according to the New York Times at the time. He had wiped out lots of people. He had been a medical doctor. He's long since been taken down in a coup, put under house arrest and sidelined. But at the time, he ruled all of Burma. I got to meet him. I got to tell him about things. This is some of the advantages of working in a dictatorship. One man, you get to him, he says, okay, it's okay. He said, how could you justify saving the whole valley? He said, we've got reports of oil in the valley. What if we find oil in the valley? I said, fine. You can do oil drilling in the valley. You could do all these things in the valley as long as we zone it. We do multi-use zoning. We set up buffer areas. The core is protected, but it's a huge, there's a wildlife sanctuary at the core and a huge tiger reserve. And this led by far to the world's largest tiger reserve called Hukong Valley Tiger Reserve, 9,000 square miles. While I was in the process, it took years to get that thing set aside. While I was trying to get that set aside, we also did more exploration and eventually hooked up Hukong Valley to Cockaboorazy with 4 protected areas with a total of, I can never remember the exact total, something like 12,000 square miles. It's about the size of the country of Belgium, and it's a third larger than the country of Israel. This was great. The tigers and the wildlife had a country-sized home. This was wonderful. But I knew by now, I'd learned my lesson, I thought, that if we wanted to really save the wild, save a species throughout its entire range, it still took more than this. It took more than just that area on the map. We had to figure out how to make corridors, how to allow these animals to move. And it turns out they do. The big cats move. This is how they survived the Pleistocene. To move along what we call the Himalayan corridor, the Central Indian corridor, the Western Ghats corridor, the whole Indo-Chinese corridor. So from this, the largest area of protected chunk, we started putting into place, and we're still working on this now. This will take maybe a lifetime. If all of this will not happen, but some of this will. Tigers are gone from Cambodia. They're trying to bring it back. This is a work in progress. You have to shoot for the moon. You always have to go for more than what you think. If I ask for a protected area and the government agrees, then I know I asked for too little. You always have to shoot high. And I took that lesson to the jaguars. And we started the 2-decade-long Jaguar corridor, which is now in progress. 18 countries, 2 continents. This is what I work on. Most of my life now is devoted to the Jaguar corridor and to the Tiger corridor. I'm doing a National Geographic special about this Jaguar corridor. There's unbelievable diversity in this world. In every family unit, every taxonomic group, just the cats, 37 different species of cats in the world. They all need their own corridors. They all need areas. But the core areas, every animal, all animals need, despite corridors, areas where they're protected, areas that are their home. And these areas, this is not, my work is not about saving cats. People ask me why I love cats so much. Yes, I can say the stories about when I was a child, but the bottom line is it's not about the cats, only the cats. I'm allergic to cats. I mean, I am. I'm truly allergic. When I worked on jaguars and tigers, I would have to take medication or my face would swell up. I'm allergic to cats. The cats are the apex predator. By saving cats, I know that I'm protecting the frogs and the snakes and the turtles and the lizards. I know I'm protecting animals that are going to be wiped out. And I cannot get an audience with Secretary One or with a minister or with a president, like I met with President Santos in Colombia for the Jaguar. I can't get those meetings for monkeys or for turtles or for snakes, but I can get them for the big cats because no government and no head of state wants to lose their iconic big cats. So we use the big cats. We use them to get huge areas, to get corridors that many species can use. We use them to save wildness, to save wildlife. And in the meantime, we create truly large areas. It's very easy to create a zoo or a safari park. Many Indian protected areas are basically safari parks, if they're not connected. To save the true wild, you need big areas where the animals can do what they naturally do in nature. And more importantly, where they can breed and have their young unencumbered. That takes safe areas. Outside of these core protected areas, they need landscapes. They need places where they can wander, where young males can go off on their own. When the female kicks out her young and say, you're a teenager now, get out of the house, they have to go find new areas. And these areas are through the human landscape. And as much as I have spent my life running away from people, I realize now, whether I like it or not, that people are the key to saving animals, to saving wildlife, to ultimately saving our world. That it's going to be about people, what we do, how we act, how we treat the wildlife that's in our care. Everything has got a voice. Everything. We have to let that voice be heard. Sometimes you can't always hear the voice very clearly in the way you think, but there's a voice there. And you have to listen closely, and you'll be able to hear it. Because that's the only way we'll understand, and that's the only way we'll save things. And when we save wildlife, and this is something young people know better than older people, wildlife is not just something outside of us. Wildlife is something inside of us. It's something that's a part of us. It makes up our health and well-being. And when we save the world, we're not doing the world a favor. We're saving ourselves, because this is a part of what we are, and it's part of the ecological fabric of the very tenuous world we live in. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. Is there somebody that would have a question for Dr. Rabinowitz?
I'm sure you get this question all the time, but the big cats or any of the other animals don't have maps. They don't read signposts. Are you consistently amazed on how well they do track and find the corridors and work their way around? Have you had that opportunity to track them through these corridors?
I'm unbelievably amazed, and where I'm most amazed is in India, with arguably, some people say now, a population that has surpassed China, or will very, very shortly, much smaller than China, very limited land. While it has some of the richest billionaires in the world, it's got some of the poorest people in the world, desperately hungry for land and food. And through this unbelievably dense, packed, crazy human landscape, tigers still find their way along rivers. It's the Underground Railway. And many Indians, some people know that, we see a tiger track maybe once a month. So we know it's by thing. They don't mind because they're not hurting people. But many people say, we don't know, there are no more tigers here, it's all people. But the tigers are making their way through. This ability, I often say, I wrote my latest book, An Indomitable Beast, talks about how much humans can learn. If we're worried about climate change, if we're worried about how to deal with climate change and what lessons can be learned, what we should look at are what large predators survived the worst climate change in known history, which was the Pleistocene. 18 glacial interglacial cycles, which killed off 85% of the megafauna, of the big animals. But these animals that survived, the big cats that survived, they survived that by being able to move, to disperse. Same thing that by adapting. They found the corridor, the Pleistocene corridor that goes over Beringia for the jaguars, is what saved the jaguar. While the European jaguar went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, the jaguar survived then in North America. So yes, am I constantly amazed? I'm more than amazed. And I have to constantly remind myself, stop, because it's hard for a human. Stop trying to box it. Stop trying to because as a scientist, you want to explain it. And usually you explain it by creating a framework. And it's those frameworks that can stop you sometimes from seeing what's there, seeing with new eyes. So I have to constantly make myself go blank sometimes when I'm in a situation where just my senses are overwhelming me, and sometimes it comes to me. Probably a lot of times it doesn't.
Is there one more question?
I have a question about talking to animals, because I completely agree with you. You can, in fact, talk to almost all wild animals if you can get them to listen to you and you listen to them. I was talking to a woodchuck this morning. He didn't like me, but nevertheless, I knew what he was saying, and he knew what I was saying with respect to it. So I agree with you. You must live with these animals and talk to them.
And not only can you talk to them, but there's been enough scientific studies. Your animals, talking to animals or having pets, which I'm sure a lot of people know, but there's been studies on them. It lowers blood pressure. It physiologically decreases stress. It increases the oxytocin level, the oxytocin called the love drug or the smile drug, the drug that makes you happy in your body, that you want to produce. Animals, people with animals helping create. And I don't know why it's taken so long, frankly, why we're still discovering about service animals, about using animals for people with terminal illnesses, for the elderly. In other parts of the world, people have known that for a long time. Animals are allowed in hospitals. They can spend all the time a sick person wants with them in a hospital. Try to get an animal in a hospital here. And yet, animals do more. It's more than that we just talk to them. They actually help us in terms of health.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rabinowitz.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Dr. Rabinowitz will be available for some book signing. There are his books and Roy Chapman Andrews' books in the back lobby, but he'll be here for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to have your book signed. Thank you for coming.
You want me to sign